Hello, my name is Johnny Gartner, and thank you so much for joining us for episode 9 of the Cedar60 Podcast. This week's interview is an episode with Dr. Seth Hamman on cybersecurity, cyber policy, and Christianity. Dr. Hamman serves as Director and Associate Professor of Cyber Operations and Computer Science here at Cedarville University and earned his PhD while studying cybersecurity at the Air Force Graduate School, the Air Force Institute of Technology, which is located on Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. As a researcher, Dr. Hamman recently co-authored a paper titled Deciphering Cyber Operations and has given a TED Talk titled Guardians of the Cyber Galaxy. And now, here's my interview with Dr. Seth Hamman. Dr. Hamman, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Could you just talk about maybe the history of cybersecurity, cyber operations, and kind of why it's important today?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, the internet's really only been with us since sometime in the 90s. Mm-hmm. The first computer packet ever was sent in October of 1969. So a couple months after man landed on the moon, the very first computer packet traveled over the telephone lines. And so that's kind of the birth of computer networking. And then there was this thing called the ARPANET. And really the internet hit the mainstream when Tim Berners-Lee designed the HTTP protocol and HTML and essentially the web browser. And that's when, every company, every organization wanted to have a website. So that's dated basically to the early 90s. Okay. E-commerce came online. And then, just the proliferation of the internet, of websites, and the importance of cyberspace to our daily lives has just grown exponentially, I think, every year.
Yeah.
So, that's kind of some of the history of cyberspace and why it's important is just because we become more and more dependent on it. Mm-hmm. We're more deeply entrenched. And the pandemic has only, I don't know that it changed much, but it certainly accelerated our dependency with all the, remote learning, telehealth, telecommuting. We had kind of an infrastructure in place that was probably underutilized, and now we're just utilizing it more fully to kind of do everything online.
Right.
And when the pandemic, the constraints lift, I think a lot of these things will just stay normal. Mm-hmm. People will continue working from home and other things. There's some efficiencies to be gained. Mm-hmm. So hugely important and getting more important because we live our lives in two worlds.
Yeah.
Physical space and cyberspace, right. And we want to have our rights protected and respected in both worlds, and that's what cybersecurity is all about for the cyberspace world.
Yeah, so cyberspace has been in the news a lot, whether it be big tech and social media or whether it be the hacks from the government that just happened a couple weeks ago. Mm-hmm. Those are things that are on the front line of the news, but can you talk about just what are some of the challenges that come along with our dependence on it like that? And yes. How maybe it's being addressed?
Yes. So when the internet was invented, it was a Advanced Research Projects Agency. It was a government-sponsored project, and it was federal money, and this was going on at several universities around the country, maybe a handful. And they laid the groundwork for the internet, and they proved how you could have computers communicating to other computers, and data could be sent, and it was amazing. It worked extremely well. And but their idea back then was that they would be sharing, the academic community, essentially the research community, would be sharing ideas between themselves, and even computing resources. Mm-hmm. So one end of the country might have a computer that specialized in computer graphics, and another end of the country might have had one that specialized in advanced mathematics. Prior to the computer network, you'd actually have to physically travel to use those computing resources. With the internet, you could be anywhere and you could use either computer and, advance your research and get the data that you needed. But that's the context in which cyberspace came. And at that point, there were not that many people on the internet. They were all kind of known to each other. They trusted one another. And so security, while it was a burden on the network, and it was kind of not important, so it got pretty much left out. Mm-hmm. And then it became so deeply entrenched. Everything, once things started happening, they happened so fast that we were still riding this kind of fundamentally insecure internet.
Right.
And now we've built so much on top of it. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, that's our foundation, and it's mind-boggling. that we could ever kind of start all over again. So what we end up doing is kind of patching it, putting Band-Aids and things on it. So that's one of the reasons why we have a lot of cyber insecurity these days, kind of like from a more technical perspective.
So based on what you just said, I think the internet is basically one computer started it, I suppose, and it just shares information from computer to computer to server to server. So what's the flaws in a system like that? Like, why is it that people can hack into something like that, and what's at risk of being lost when that happens?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, so it's a global network of computers. To be on the internet means that you can reach any other computer on the internet essentially instantaneously. But there's no direct path between point A and point B. There's a path, but it's not a direct path. That means it needs other servers to help it along, other computers we call routers, that kind of live in the core of the network, and then our phones live, and our Internet of Things devices live on the edges. And so our data is, like, by nature, it's out in the open. It is shared over the network. And we don't really know where it's going or how it gets there. Now, I'm not saying nobody knows,
right.
but we certainly don't.
Right.
And as users of the internet. So there's lots of opportunities for bad things to happen, for our traffic to be intercepted, to be manipulated, to maybe be delayed or indefinitely postponed, modified in transit. And so we obviously have protections in place to prevent that from happening, but sometimes our protections aren't what we think they are, and it turns out, well, people were able to read our traffic even though we thought they weren't, and that's kind of the world in which we live. It's such a complex world, and we kind of think of it, I mean, here's an example, we think of it as a cloud. That's a convenient way for us to think of it, but what that's doing is it's covering up so much complexity of how it really works. You know, how there's actual servers, they're plugged into electricity, there's circuits and transistors and data flowing through wires and over electromagnetic pulses, and so, like, this is actually what's going on. And in all that complexity, there live opportunities for people that can kind of dig a little bit deeper than we can, and can essentially pull the wool over our eyes, because we don't really know what's going on, and we kind of don't suspect or don't even know what has happened.
Right.
And that even goes for big organizations that have a huge interest in cybersecurity. No single person can have the type of visibility they really need into how things are actually working, what's really going on. And so it used to be, and this has been decreasing, but it used to be when an organization was compromised and when they had actually unauthorized users in their network, on average it would take over a year for them to even realize that it occurred.
Wow. So
you can do a lot of damage if you gain unauthorized access to a computer network in a day, and really even in minutes. Think about being on a network for years. No one knows that you're there. Like, you're kind of hiding out in the shadows of cyberspace. Again, it's because of the complexity, all the moving parts. It's been said in security that complexity is the adversary of security, because it just makes it lowers our visibility, it lowers our understanding, it lowers kind of the light that we can shine, which makes room for the bad guys to operate.
So you've recently done a TED Talk addressing some of these issues, kind of from a Christian perspective, but also just from a perspective of being in the field. So can you kind of address how what you just talked about fits into that TED Talk? And if you're watching, look in the description below for a link to the TED Talk. We'd love for you to go and take a look at that.
Yeah, so last summer in Dayton, I delivered a TEDx talk, and it's titled Guardians of the Cyber Galaxy. And what I do is I kind of talk about some of the fundamental features of the internet or of cyberspace that differentiate it from physical space, and identify what I call the 3Ds: distanceless, digital, and dynamic. And then I say all these things, they add up to dark. And again, darkness is kind of the enemy of security. If we can't see what's going on. And in another way, cyberspace kind of makes supervillains out of our adversaries. Like, they can get anywhere they want at the speed of light. They can move whatever they want by just typing a few fingers, so they can move bunches of money and intellectual property. So they kind of have superhuman strength, superhuman speed, and they're also invincible because it's their digital selves out there. It's not their physical selves. And so you can kind of think of them operating and wreaking havoc, as a villain, and we need cyber superheroes to protect us. So that was kind of the point of my talk. We have cyber supervillains, and we need cyber superheroes that can compete with them on a level playing field, that can understand their tricks, that can, you know, battle it out with them in the trenches of cyberspace, can, you know, not have the wool pulled over their eyes and actually see what's going on, and uncover the activity and expose it for what it is. And so the big idea with my talk was really how we can develop cyber superheroes and why that's so important. And the one thing that I really tuned in on is that if we think about what we should really look for in our cyber superheroes, we need to be able to trust them. Yeah. They need to be good people. You know, just like the superheroes in the movies, you know, we can count on them to do the right thing. And, you know, sometimes they might have an easier time catching the bad guy if they were to bend a few rules, or not worry so much about, you know, collateral damage and, you know, the innocent civilians. You know, that bad guys love to, in the movies, you know, they'll take somebody hostage and they'll get away. And the good guys just kind of have to watch and stand by, because there's some things that are more important in that moment, and they always do the right thing.
Yeah, that's a wonderful analogy.
Yeah, and so what's nice about that is in the end, the good guys win. Yeah. And they do it the right way, and they follow the rules. And so in cyberspace, we need to do it the right way. Yeah. We need to follow the rules. And in a cybersecurity education program like the one that we run here at Cedarville, that's in the forefront. Yeah. It's about ethics. It's about character. And so we want to make sure that our people know that they belong to a story that's bigger than themselves, and it's a noble story, and they want to participate, and they're protecting people. And it's an important job, and there's the right way to do it. Yeah. And that's what we want them to do.
This is kind of a broad question, but it kind of goes on what you just talked about. So can you address kind of like at this university, from an academic standpoint, what's being taught to address the issues that you just put out, and that at the broader academic level and even at the institutional and governmental level, these kinds of things that are being done?
Yeah, I mean, so cybersecurity education itself is a huge field, and there's lots of space in that field. I mean, it spans. Here at Cedarville, our cyber program, the one I'm talking about, which is our main cyber program, is in the School of Engineering and Computer Science. Right. And our major is called Cyber Operations. And so we're really talking about kind of the intelligence operations, more of the hacking and penetration testing type of cybersecurity. It's highly technical. Right. So these are the people that really understand the ones and the zeros of cyberspace. Right. And you get in, and we're an NSA designated school. Right. We're a Center of Academic Excellence in Cyber Operations, which means that the NSA has kind of laid out some framework for how they want their people to be educated, ideally, and we've met that criteria, and so that's why we've achieved the designation. So that's who we teach here prominently, and a lot of our students go out and they get top secret security clearances. Some of them do go and work for the NSA, others will go and work for a defense contractor, and then maybe through them, through some DOD or other government organization. So that's kind of what our kind of niche is, but there's a lot of other niches if you talk about across the academia. Right. You can get into public policy, cyber law, you can get into cyber IT, which is more like how does an organization make sure they're secure, and that gets into systems administration, firewall installations, and monitoring logs and all those types of things, which is more of a school of business type of function, thinking about risk management. Right. And then criminal justice. Yeah. There's this whole cyber region in there where they're thinking about criminal activity, how to do chain of custody and evidence, how to do the forensics that need to be done to get the evidence they need, and how to track people down, and all of those things. So cyber is huge, and all of those things are important. Yeah. But I think where we are, and it's because of our relationships, so many relationships with the Air Force Base, and so many of our people have been affiliated with the Air Force, we're on the more technical end of the spectrum.
Cool. So you just listed off a bunch of different majors and like areas of study like criminal justice and business and IT and plenty more that are focusing. And so it's obvious that cyberspace is, as you mentioned earlier, affecting more and more and more aspects of our life. So why as Christians is this important? Like, what role do we as Christians living in the world have in making sure that we're a part of this process? And I think you've alluded to it in why you want to train students by creating this new department, but what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for one, so we are stewards,
Right.
And that's pretty clear in the Bible that God has made us stewards over things, and He expects us to use our resources well and use it wisely. And so, as users of technology, I think Christians need to be thoughtful users. We need to consider what we're doing in cyberspace, what risks we're taking. We need to have some level of education to kind of understand those risks and whether they're worthwhile risks. So I think that's a role that Christians need to thoughtfully engage in as protectors, as like cybersecurity personnel and people that are out there in the trenches. I alluded to that they need to be trustworthy.
Right.
And at Cedarville, that's real easy for us in terms of this idea of being part of a noble story bigger than yourself, which is where kind of character comes from. It's this idea that I have something worth sacrificing for. And yeah, I mean, character involves sacrifice. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a highly admired attribute. But oftentimes when we make the right choice, we give something up. We miss an opportunity to make ourselves look good or smarter than we really are or better than we really are, or maybe make some money that we could have made, maybe get a promotion that we could have had. So we're willing to forego those things because we know that before God, we want to do the right thing, and we'll let Him handle whether or not we got the promotion or didn't, you know, and we can trust that that's in His hands.
And maybe on a more practical, this might be a little too singularly focused, but like in our daily lives, what are kind of the steps that we can be taking? And you mentioned sacrifices. I'm sure there's things that we're going to have to start thinking, maybe we should give these things up. Is there something that you can think of, or things off the top of your mind that like, geez, we should probably start contemplating that, man, this is something we really shouldn't be doing anymore?
As a society, I'm not sure. I just think that I don't know that I have those answers, but except for that we should think critically. I mean, there's a old saying, you know, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. And I think we've rushed in, and I think just as a society, we've seen the kind of shiny thing and we've grabbed for it, and we've kind of gotten ourselves into a predicament where now we kind of we count on the internet, for example. And I think as Christians, I mean, we just need to thoughtfully engage with the technologies that we use, the amount that we use. You know, in the short term, we tend to overestimate the impact of a new technology, but in the long term, we underestimate. And so I think we've potentially underestimated how this is impacting us. You know, like, for example, like doing church online. What we can kind of see some of those short-term impacts, which we may tend to overemphasize, but like the real profound impacts are the longer term, which are really hard for us to kind of understand and conceive of. But we should be very thoughtful in how we use the internet, how much of the internet we use. You know, as a parent with our children, we need to think about what we're exposing them to. And even if it's, you know, there's the dark corners of the internet, which we need to be very wary of, but even, you know, educational content that's online, we need to think carefully about how much of that we want to indulge in.
So, I think this is more of a political question than it is a religious question, but as Christians engaging with the culture around us, with hopefully interacting with people who address these kinds of policy issues, what kinds of things should we be looking at and reading to be knowledgeable about this, so we can go to those people who make the decisions and say, we think you should push the brake on this?
Wow. So right now there's a huge debate going on at a nation state level about how we should engage other nation states in cyberspace. And so this is getting a little bit out of my realm of expertise, but I have worked with a team of political scientists at the University of Cincinnati, and what I am fascinated by these concepts and these ideas, because it's so important. And it's cyber operations, although I'm more interested in the ones and zeros, but ultimately it's the policies, it's the strategies. But there's a lot of debate right now. The DoD, U.S. Cyber Command, they've unveiled the last couple years a new strategy in cyberspace that's less focused on deterring our adversaries, which has been kind of our nuclear war mentality, that we can build all these weapons and essentially kind of have this mutually assured destruction thing going on, and then no one will ever fire a weapon, and then we're all safer. Well, that doesn't work with cyberspace.
Yeah.
There's not this idea that, well, we can just stockpile all these cyber weapons and then we'll scare our adversaries away from ever, infringing on our cyber sovereignty. I think that was our idea, and time has shown that doesn't work. We need to have a different approach in cyberspace.
Yeah.
So what's one of those approaches is called persistent engagement.
Yeah.
And it has this idea of defending forward. So in physical space, nation states are very careful about national sovereignty and about infringing on a border. And in cyberspace, that's kind of the mentality we used to have, and that we're loosening that now at a nation-state policy level, because cyberspace isn't like physical space.
Yeah. And
the borders and things aren't the same. And so what does it mean to have a presence in an adversary's cyberspace domain? And is that the same thing as being physically present there?
Yeah.
And so what we have as a country have done is made that, we openly talk about it, that yes, we're going to try to understand what our adversaries are doing and create friction in their networks, rather than just sitting back hoping they don't do anything or trying to deter them from doing something, and then realize something bad has happened, and then realizing that deterrence didn't work. And deterrence means that we need to have a credible threat, that if you do this, here's a line in the sand, if you cross this line, we're going to do that. Well, we don't really have that credible threat. It's really hard to draw lines in the sand. And so our adversaries kind of operate kind of below the level of armed attack, and which would be recognized by the international community as going too far, and which would mean that we can have a proportionate response. But they just kind of operate right below that line. And so it just kind of, it's kind of like death by 1,000 cuts. It's just like, well, there's another data breach. There's another intellectual property that we've lost, or more information that we've ceded to our adversary. And over time, these can add up to a significant strategic advantage for them.
So this is somewhat related, but I know Cedarville really values biblical integration, and so if you can just talk about maybe what you teach in terms of what the Bible has to say on these issues, in terms of the technical aspect, and what you were talking about earlier is the character that we as Christians are called to have in whatever field we're studying. Maybe what kinds of things do you teach, and how do you think we should be prepared to handle issues like that as future leaders when it comes to how do we handle situations of all those varying kinds that you've talked about?
Yeah, well, I think the big things. So obviously there's no chapter and verse specifically for a lot of these things. So you kind of have to take the big ideas from the Bible and then think about how they apply. One big idea is just human dignity, and how we're all made in the image of God. So we need to respect one another, and that means respect each other's privacy and respect their rights, which for us is nice because that's right in our Constitution. That's something that we prize and we hold forth. That we can listen to people that disagree with us, and they have the right to speak their mind. And so, as we engage in cyberspace, we need to recognize that. And I think and also kind of like a right to privacy. And due process. And again, all these things, I think there's a very strong biblical basis. There's a reason why they're in our Constitution. And we can kind of say that we're acting biblically and we're acting according to our Constitution at the same time. Of course, if the Constitution ever tries to be reinterpreted, or it's interpreted in a way that differently, we can go back to the Bible and say, well, we're going to do it how we think God's Word says it should be done. So those are some of the ways that it works out. I mean, another idea, God is really concerned about poor people and vulnerable people, and that comes up again and again. Looking out for like the widows and the orphans. And so there's this kind of idea of a vulnerable population, and those who are stronger should bear with the weaker and help. Well, in cyberspace, we're kind of all part of a vulnerable population because we can all be getting taken advantage of. Like I said, there's so much that we don't understand that we're interacting with. We don't really know what's going on. So, it's a very noble and biblical idea to protect those that need protecting. And look out for them and make sure they have the support that they need. So those are like the big ideas that would be communicated in a Cedarville education, both in my classroom and across campus.
So thank you for all these thoughtful and insightful answers. It's really a fascinating subject, and on this podcast, we like to give the guest the last 60 seconds to just kind of either summarize or say, I really didn't get to say this, or you should really think about this. So this next 60 seconds are yours.
Well, thanks, Johnny.
You're welcome.
I appreciate just having the time to come on today. My real passion is cybersecurity education. That's my day job. And so I'm interested in how we can produce the best cyber talent that we can at Cedarville University. So I mentioned this new major. I mentioned my TED Talk where I talk about what should we be looking for in our cyber superheroes and how we can kind of accomplish that. Yeah. And we created a new major this year called Cyber Operations, which is the first of its kind in the state. So those are the things that I'm interested in, and I'd like to continue to pursue and get better at. And so that for me is fun, and it's really important.
Cool. We encourage anyone listening who has an interest in these things to look in the description below for links to the TEDx talk that Dr. Hamman referenced and to the paper he co-authored with the University of Cincinnati, as well as a link to the Cedarville University website for the cyber operations major. So thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Hamman. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hi there, YouTube. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Cedar60. If you enjoy exploring politics from a distinctly Christian perspective, please like this video, comment below about what you've learned, and share it with a friend. If you'd like to be notified about future episodes, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow Cedar60 on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook, or look for our episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks so much.